Hi, hello, I'm Jananie, and this is my channel, This Story Ain't Over. Welcome back to yet another book recommendation video. It is Pride Month, so of course I'm giving you my favorite queer book recs, the ones that made me particularly feel seen, the ones that just tickled my soul and made me feel just so happy. As I say every year with one of these month book rec videos, you do not need to only be reading queer books during Pride Month. You can read them all throughout the year. It's that simple. Out of the 15 books that I'm going to recommend to you today, half of them are contemporary fictions, and then the other half are sci-fi fantasies. And personally for me, all 15 of these books just did something so beautiful and hit a part of my soul that I feel like was never really given the space to exist. So whether you're queer or an ally or just figuring yourself out, I hope that these books will help you along the way. Now, those of you who have been following my channel for a while, you may remember some previous Pride Month book rec videos that I've done. And for the most part, I'm pretty sure those videos only covered YA books because that was what I was reading mainly at the time. So if you've been waiting for some adult book recs with some queer representation, then this video is really gonna help you out. And of course, if you're watching this video and you're looking for something more younger or on the YA side, then definitely go check out the previous versions of this video. Okay, starting strong and a little chaotic, we're gonna go with You Exist Too Much by Zaina Arafat. This book is by a Palestinian American author, and I just feel like it's one of those books that just really helps you when you're going through a tough time and trying to figure yourself out. The story is told through these little vignettes that take us from the United States to the Middle East and through different parts of the main character's life. And throughout this all, I feel like the main thread that pulls it together is the main character's struggle with her sexual identity and also her religious, cultural, and national identities. The title of the book actually comes from a scene very early on in the book when the main character comes out to her mother and her mother says that she exists too much. It was a scene that just felt so relatable to me, and I feel like a lot of the main character's struggles throughout this book were just very endearing, and I feel like if you're still figuring yourself out, you're really gonna see a lot of yourself in this book. Okay, next up I have Old Enough, and this is a book that I read last year, and I actually quite appreciated the queer representation in this book. This book deals with a main character who's bisexual, and she's dealing with that identity, but she's also trying to figure out her life between her college life and then her life from back home from her high school days, and also some of the bad things that she left behind. This book does talk about sexual assault and rape, so I would just keep that in mind if you're gonna pick it up. But what I really liked about this book was just the main character's sort of struggle between who she is now in college and who she's grown into, and that includes her queer identity, and then her struggle to reconcile that with her previous identity from back home, from when she was in high school, from before she came out and before she really knew herself. I feel like that struggle is a fairly common one for people who have come out later in life, the idea that people can't reconcile who you were before to who you are now. And so personally, I really love the way that the book dealt with that aspect and also with the aftermaths of sexual assault and the way that the character was dealing with that trauma years later. Okay, next up I have Sally Rooney, and it's my favorite Sally Rooney and the only one that I actually liked, and that is Conversations with Friends. I know a lot of people have mixed feelings about this one, but I personally love it for the bisexual representation and also all of the repressed sapphic emotions that are going on throughout this book. We follow our main character, Frances, who is in college, and she has a best friend named Bobby, and the two of them happened to date before, but now they're just good friends. And this brings us to our inciting incident when Frances and Bobby go to this local poetry night and they run into this older couple. And although the flirtation between Frances and then the husband, Nick, seems innocent at first, it definitely grows into something more. And so from there, we're following Frances through a series of chaotic decisions and just her going through it and being in this transition phase of her life, and then also dealing with some of the sort of suppressed feelings between her and Bobby as well. The way that Frances talks about Bobby in some of the narration parts of the book definitely gets me every time, and honestly I was just flipping through this earlier and I was like, I need to reread this because there's such longing in the book as well between the two sort of relationships that Frances has going on, and I just loved every moment of it. Okay, speaking of adultery and longing, I have Big Swiss by Jen Began. This is probably one of my favorite books ever and one of my favorite queer books as well. This book follows our main character Greta, who is sort of going through a midlife crisis, and she moves away from her original life and just starts over completely, and she takes a job as a transcriber for a sex therapist. So Greta spends her days transcribing these sex therapy sessions for the sex therapist who wants to create a book out of it, and Greta finds herself falling in love with one of the sex therapist's patients who she lovingly names Big Swiss. So Big Swiss is this younger woman and she's married, but she's never actually experienced an orgasm, which is why she's seeing the sex therapist. From there, the book gets really kooky because Greta starts to use some of the stuff that she knows about Big Swiss from the therapy sessions to woo her in real life. If you're gonna go into this book, I have to warn you that it is a satire, so a lot of things are intentionally exaggerated and the plotline is fairly ridiculous, but it all proves a fairly dark and compelling story about the main character and her sexual identity and her mental mental health. Greta as a character is definitely going through it, and I love the mental illness representation in this book, but I also just really love the endearing nature of Greta as a character and all the ridiculous mistakes she makes along the way. This is definitely one of those messy books, but I felt like the sapphic relationship in this book was not only funny, but also compelling and very awkward at times, but also really beautiful, and I just cannot explain to you how weird but also lovely it is. Alrighty, next up I have two books by the same author who I've mentioned multiple times on my channel before, and that is S.J. Sindhu. So first up I have Marriage of a Thousand Lies, and this one I would highly recommend to anyone who is like a child of immigrants or comes from a very conservative background where queerness is not really accepted and the concept of like coming out would be unheard of. This book follows a Sri Lankan Tamil woman, and she is a lesbian, and she's in this fake marriage with one of her dear friends who is also Sri Lankan Tamil and also gay. The two of them sort of put on this perfect illusion of being this happily married couple to everyone in their community and their parents, but secretly they both date and maintain their own relationships and have their own things going on. Now, the inciting incident of the book is when the main character's grandmother falls ill, and so she decides to return home to like keep her company and take care of her, and this is where she rekindles a friendship with a childhood best friend named Nisha. But the catch is that Nisha was actually the main character's first ever lover, and Nisha has just told her that she's about to get married. So of course this brings up a lot of tense emotions, and the main character starts to think on her choices in life and sort of the lie that she's living in order to appease her family and community, and how that's ultimately making her feel untrue to herself. I absolutely love this book because it is a experience that I feel like is not talked about enough. I am Sri Lankan Tamil as well, and I feel like I related to so many parts of this book that I just can't even explain to you because it was just so perfect. So if you're a queer brown kid, maybe go read this. And then S.J. Sindhu's other book, Blue Skin Gods, also has a lot of queer representation, but I would say that it's sort of secondary to the main story and plot line. There are a lot of queer characters throughout the book, and the main character himself explores his sexual identity towards the second half of the book. So I definitely think it has some great representation, but I wouldn't go into it expecting it to be like the whole main point of the book. Okay, next up I have a sapphic romance that I read recently and I've absolutely fell in love with, and I've just been freaking out about how much I love this book on like TikTok and Instagram, and a lot of people have come back to me and been like, you need to read more by this author. She has like a sequel that you need to read, and that book is Meeting Millie by Claire Ashton. I read this for a video where I read spicy romance books, and this was the only queer one on that list, and luckily it was freaking fantastic. It was super cute. It's just really one of those books that I wish someone had recommended to me years ago because it was just so lovely. Essentially the book follows Charlotte and Millie. Charlotte is gay and Millie is seemingly straight when we first meet her, and these two used to be college besties when they went to Oxford, and when the book opens we're actually meeting them like 10 years later when they're both in Oxford again for their respective jobs, and the two of them start to rekindle their friendship after these many years and after a fallout that they had at the end of university. And part of that fallout had to do with the fact that Charlotte was in love with Millie and Millie was not in love with Charlotte, but as the book goes on you start to realize that Millie had some complicated feelings about herself, about Charlotte, and about her own sexual identity. Okay, and then I have a memoir, and this is the only one on the list, and that's In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. I've talked about this book many times before because I just think it's a fantastic memoir and also just a fantastically written book. It essentially discusses the author's experience in a same-sex abusive relationship, and I feel like that's a topic that's never really talked about, and the author actually touches on that point, the fact that this is something that's not often talked about, and they detail this experience in the second person. You cried in front of many people, you lost yourself in this relationship, yada yada yada. This is definitely one of the heavier reads on the list, but it's so worth it, and it's such a short book that you can knock it out in a day. Okay, let's move on to the sci-fi fantasy queer book recs that I have. Okay, first up I have Sweet Lust, and this is a collection of short stories, and I read this last year and I really enjoyed it. I have to say it's a super weird book, so bear that in mind when you're going into it, but essentially all of the stories involve some sort of sci-fi fantasy element. Sometimes they're like set in the far future or on a different planet or in a different type of society or like construction of humanity, but in each story there is some element of queerness, which I think was just so nice to see in a sci-fi fantasy book or collection of stories, because very often I feel like speculative fiction takes these leaps in imagination, but it doesn't really think about how queerness might fit into that. So it was just really interesting to see that in this short story collection. On a similar note, I have This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Motar and Max Gladstone. This is a really short book that is mostly a sci-fi, and it's one that I definitely think you'll fall in love with. It's a sapphic romance, and it involves these two agents of these like opposing sides, and they both live in sort of this dying world. The two of them are trying to find ways to win this war, and they're sort of like spies going across time time, and they find themselves accidentally sort of writing to each other and somehow falling in love through these words that they are sharing to each other to sort of throw each other off their trail and to also get ahead of each other and learn more about each other. And honestly, it's such a weird book that I can't really explain what it's like. You just have to read it to experience it because it's just really beautiful. Okay, next I have a cozy fantasy that was honestly just so freaking cute, and that's Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. I know a lot of people have been talking about this one, especially on like Book Talk and stuff, but it's just really so cute and such a fun book. This book is for the people who like sci-fi fantasy, but you don't really care to get like invested in all of the big high stakes stuff. Essentially, we follow our main character who is a battle-weary orc, and she wants to open up a coffee shop. But of course, in this fantasy world, people don't know what coffee is or what a coffee shop is. And so she has to sort of go through a lot of hurdles to even get this coffee shop open and figure out a menu and get customers coming in because people don't really know what it is. And from there, it's just a really cute story of her like setting up this coffee shop and like hiring people and getting to know the people in town and forming a community and falling in love. And particularly for me, I feel like this was just such a heartwarming read, and I just found myself so obsessed with like what the new menu item was gonna be and what they were gonna call it, and all of these like little things just seemed so interesting to me, and I just loved how it worked. Okay, next I have a classic sci-fi fantasy queer book rec that everyone probably knows, but I need to reiterate how lovely it is, and that is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This essentially follows the story of Achilles and Patroclus and sort of reads between the lines of the original mythology. We follow Achilles and his best friend Patroclus from when they're children into the events of the Trojan War, and we are seeing their relationship develop over that entire time. And the book is actually told from Patroclus's perspective, so it's really interesting to see how his love of Achilles sort of forms his view of him. And it's definitely just so beautifully written and leaves you so heartbroken by the end, so definitely bring the tissues with you. Okay, next up I have House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson. This is definitely one of my new favorite vampire novels ever because it's just such an interesting take on the concept of vampires. Essentially, this is set in a fantasy world where in the north, the nobility drink the blood of these women called blood maids, and it essentially keeps them young and beautiful and powerful. And so our main character is from the south, and she's sort of poor and she doesn't know what to do, and she's hearing about these blood maids and how you can become one and get all these comforts in life while serving this noble master and just giving them your blood. And so the main character becomes this blood maid for this noble woman, and from there there's sort of a sapphic romance that blooms, but also this really beautiful friendship between her and the other blood maids. But of course, this is a horror novel, so it's not all like sunshine and rainbows, and it definitely gets dark and creepy and weird. And I would say that the romance is definitely more of like an obsession and toxic relationship than a good one, but it's really interesting. I feel like this is one of those books that really could have easily been just like so hetero, but the author consciously decided to make it sapphic, and so that changed the dynamic in a really interesting way. On a very similar note, I have A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This also deals with vampires, and specifically the main character is one of Dracula's brides. So essentially we're following the main character Constanta as she details her life and experience with Dracula over these like many decades and years in this like really long letter that is written to him. So the book is written in second person, and it's just really interesting the way that Constanta details the abusive relationship that she ultimately had with Dracula. But where this book gets queer and gets really interesting is actually through the other brides that Dracula has. So he actually has multiple by the end of the book, and Constanta finds herself falling in love with some of them, and Dracula's relationship with some of these brides, who some of them happen to be men, also ends up being sort of this polyamorous relationship between these four characters. What I really liked about the polyamorous relationship was just the love and devotion and care that the characters had between them, aside from obviously Dracula, and also how they're each individually dealing with this sort of toxic relationship with Dracula and how they start to come together to help each other. This is definitely a dark, very sexy, very seductive read, and it delivers on all aspects. Alrighty, and then the final book that I want to recommend today is Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Huang. This is a book that I actually didn't know was partly queer and sapphic when I went into it, but it actually is. It's a very small part of the book, but I do think it's significant enough that you could pick it up for that reason. Essentially, this book covers the topic of like natural beauty and what that means. So our main character is approached by this strange woman to like start this job at this holistic natural beauty company called Holistic. And from there, the main character, along with her coworkers, are put under these like different beauty treatments and regimens to keep themselves looking really beautiful for when they work at the store. And they're also administering all of these strange beauty treatments and products to their customers customers, and you start to realize that there's something sort of sinister going on. This is actually a horror book, so it has a lot of horror elements. It gets really weird, really creepy, and really gross at some points, so just keep that in mind. But there is an element of the main character forming this sort of unlikely friendship and relationship with another character who happens to be in a little bit more of a powerful position than she is. And that whole aspect, I feel like, added another layer to the book, which I really like. I feel like the main character could have easily been straight and it would have been kind of boring, but the element of her actually being queer added another element to the story and another dimension that I think made it more nuanced and interesting. Alrighty, with that said, those are all 15 books that I want to recommend to you today of queer books that made me particularly feel seen. I hope you guys enjoy this and that you found a new book that you want to pick up, and I hope that you will continue to read books by queer authors throughout the year and not just through Pride Month. As always, thank you so much to my bindery members for supporting me and my channel and making all of this possible. And if you haven't heard from my previous announcement video, I am actually going to be publishing a book with my publishing imprint Boundless Press. The book is called Dust Settles North by Dina El-Ganaidi, and it's coming out in summer 2025. So if you'd like to know more about the release, then go check out the announcement video down below. And if you'd like to support me and my channel and actually help publish this book, then definitely go check out my bindery community down below. As always, if you haven't already, go check out my Instagram, TikTok, and Goodreads down below, and I will see you in my next video. So please remember that this story ain't over. Bye.